At the far southwestern edge of Santa Barbara County, California, the coastline does something unusual. It bends toward the Pacific, the cliffs rise sharply above cold water, and the currents around the headland can change with remarkable speed. For centuries, sailors have known this place as dangerous water. But long before charts, lighthouses, and Spanish names, the Chumash knew the headland as Humkak. In their traditional world, it was more than a difficult point on a voyage. It was a boundary, a western threshold associated with the passage of spirits from the world of the living into another realm. The location itself became part of a cultural geography in which the ocean was not simply an empty space between places, but a landscape filled with meaning, memory, danger, and roots that had been understood for generations. In the final years of the 19th century, a rancher living near the old mission country reportedly began recording conversations with a Chumash elder. He was not an anthropologist, archaeologist, or government surveyor. He had no formal training in indigenous languages or ethnography. He was simply writing down what he understood from conversations with someone whose generation still carried fragments of knowledge from a coastline radically different from the one surrounding them. Among the stories was an account of a village that had once stood near the channel, a place where people had lived, fished, traveled by canoe, obtained fresh water, and buried their dead. The remarkable claim was not merely that the village had been abandoned, it was that part of the ground itself was gone. According to the later reconstruction of the rancher's notes, the elder described land that people had once walked upon as though it had gradually disappeared beneath the water. The loss was not remembered as a single explosion, earthquake, or enormous wave. Instead, the description suggested a slow transformation. Shorelines changed, ground eroded, water reached farther inland. Familiar places became inaccessible. A community that had once existed close to the channel was eventually separated from the living world by water. The account contained details about fishing, canoes, burials, and a landscape that no longer existed above the surface. To someone unfamiliar with the geological history of the region, those details might have sounded like folklore. But the physical coastline of the Santa Barbara Channel really did change dramatically over thousands of years. There is also an important limitation that cannot be ignored. The original notebooks are not available as a complete, certified primary source. What survives appears to have passed through family records, later transcription, and regional historical material. That means individual sentences cannot be treated as a verbatim record of what the elder actually said. The story has passed through several people, several decades, and several layers of interpretation. On its own, it cannot establish that a particular village lies beneath the channel, but dismissing it entirely would also miss something important. The underlying geographical claim can be examined independently because Chumash traditions from other sources, archaeological evidence, and geological research all point toward a region whose coastline has changed far more dramatically than a modern map suggests. Before the missions, the Chumash occupied one of the most densely settled maritime regions of pre-contact North America. Their communities extended along the coast from roughly the San Luis Obispo region through Santa Barbara and Ventura and across the northern Channel Islands. Estimates of the pre-contact population vary, but researchers generally describe a substantial population distributed among numerous permanent villages. These were not isolated groups living only from whatever happened to be available each day. They maintained specialized economies, long-distance exchange networks, social relationships between communities, and an intimate understanding of the marine environment. The ocean connected them as much as it separated them. One of the clearest examples was the Tomol, the Chumash plank canoe. These vessels were constructed from wooden planks joined together with specialized techniques and sealed against water. A capable Tomol could transport people and cargo across open water between the mainland and the islands. That required far more than the ability to paddle. It required knowledge of currents, weather, navigation, seasonal conditions, fishing grounds, landing places, and the behavior of the channel itself. A community that regularly crossed the Santa Barbara Channel could not afford to treat the sea as an unpredictable void. It had to know the water as carefully as another society might know a road system. Trade reinforced that relationship. Shell beads served as a form of standardized currency across the region, while soapstone from the islands, food from the mainland, marine products, stone, and other resources moved between communities. Archaeological sites preserve evidence of these exchanges, allowing researchers to reconstruct aspects of an economy that existed centuries before written records from Europeans. The Santa Barbara Channel was therefore not a remote frontier. It was part of a sophisticated coastal network. The location of villages, freshwater sources, beaches, canoe launch points, fishing areas, and burial grounds mattered enormously. If the coastline changed, the entire geography of community life changed with it. Then the missions arrived. Mission La Purísima was established in 1787. Mission Santa Barbara followed in 1789, and Mission Santa Ynez in 1804. Within a relatively short period, the social world that had developed over centuries was subjected to enormous disruption. Introduced diseases caused catastrophic mortality. Families were drawn or forced into mission communities. Marriage and village networks were reorganized. Traditional economic systems were disrupted. Places that had been continuously occupied for generations were abandoned or transformed. Languages began losing speakers, and knowledge that had once been distributed across entire communities increasingly depended upon a much smaller number of elders. The destruction was not simply cultural in the abstract, it affected geography. When a village disappears, the knowledge of its surrounding landscape can disappear with it. A particular spring may no longer be visited, a trail may cease to be used, a beach may lose its traditional name. A crossing route may survive only in a story. A burial ground can become indistinguishable from ordinary ground after enough generations have passed. If the physical landscape later changes as well, the problem becomes even greater. A community can lose both the people who remember a place and the landscape that once made the place visible. The Chumash did not simply accept these changes without resistance. In 1824, Chumash people at Mission Santa Ynez, Mission La Purísima, and Mission Santa Barbara participated in a major uprising against mission authority. La Purísima was seized and held for a period before Mexican forces retook it. Families fled into other regions rather than return to the mission system. This matters because cultural knowledge did not disappear simply because the institutions controlling the missions attempted to reorganize Chumash life. People carried memories with them. They carried language, family histories, sacred traditions, knowledge of places, and stories about landscapes that no longer belonged to them. By the late 19th century, however, the generation capable of describing the pre-mission world in detail was becoming very small. American researchers were beginning systematic ethnographic work, but they arrived after enormous cultural disruption had already taken place. They depended heavily on individual elders whose knowledge had survived through families and communities. Some information was preserved because researchers asked the right questions at the right time. Other information disappeared because nobody knew it existed. A story recorded in a private notebook by a rancher could therefore become surprisingly important, even if the notebook itself was never intended to become a historical document. European records provide another reference point. In 1542, the expedition associated with Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo entered the Santa Barbara Channel and encountered numerous Chumash communities. The expedition's descriptions were limited and written from a European perspective, but they establish an important fact. The coast was already densely inhabited and maritime long before the mission period. The villages encountered by Europeans were not newly created settlements. They belonged to cultural systems with much older roots, and the coastline beneath those communities was itself part of a much longer geological story, one that began thousands of years before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. That story becomes extraordinary when sea level enters the picture. During the height of the last ice age, enormous quantities of the planet's water were locked inside continental ice sheets. Global sea level stood roughly 390 feet below modern levels. That difference transformed coastlines across the world. Bays became plains, beaches extended far beyond their modern positions. Rivers continued across areas that are now seabed. Islands that appear separate on today's maps could be connected or dramatically larger. The Santa Barbara Channel was no exception. The landscape that ancient coastal peoples knew was not simply an earlier version of today's coastline. In many places, it was a fundamentally different landscape. The Northern Channel Islands provide the clearest example. San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz, and Anacapa were once connected into a larger landmass known to geologists as Santa Rosae. What are now separate islands formed part of a much larger landscape. The mainland was also closer to this ancient island system than it is today. As glaciers melted and sea level rose, the old landscape was progressively drowned. Santa Rosae fragmented, channels widened, low coastal areas disappeared beneath the sea. The process was not a single event. It unfolded over thousands of years, although some periods of sea level rise were much faster than others. For people living through those changes, the transformation would have been visible. A shoreline can move slowly enough that no single generation thinks of itself as witnessing a catastrophe, while still moving dramatically over centuries. A fishing ground can become deeper, a beach can narrow, a freshwater area can become brackish, a familiar route can become impossible. A place where people once camped can disappear underwater. Oral traditions are particularly suited to preserving the memory of such changes because they do not require a precise calendar. A story can remember that ancestors once crossed somewhere that later generations could not cross in the same way. This is where the Chumash story of Limu becomes especially interesting. In the early 20th century, linguist John Peabody Harrington recorded extensive Chumash traditions through conversations with consultants including Fernando Librado, also known by his Chumash name, Quetzalcoatl. Harrington's fieldwork produced one of the most detailed surviving bodies of information about Chumash language, culture, and cosmology. Among the traditions recorded was an origin account involving Hutash, the Earth Mother, and Limu, the Chumash name for what is now Santa Cruz Island. According to the account, Hutash created the first people on Limu. As their population grew, the island became too crowded, and a way had to be found for people to reach the mainland. Hutash created a bridge across the channel, described as a rainbow. The people crossed, but some looked down into the water. Those who fell were transformed into dolphins so that they would not drown. The story explains a relationship between the Chumash and dolphins, but it also contains an extraordinary geographical element. People once crossed between an island and the mainland in a world whose physical relationship between land and water was different from the one visible today. The Rainbow Bridge should not be treated as evidence of a literal bridge made from physical light. That interpretation goes far beyond what the tradition establishes. The more interesting question is what the story is doing geographically. It describes a time when the separation between Limu and the mainland was different enough to be incorporated into a foundational narrative. The story remembers movement across water, a connection between places that modern geography treats as separated by a significant channel, and a transformation in which people who fell into the sea became part of the marine world. Geology provides a remarkable context for that tradition. When sea level was much lower, the islands were larger and the channel configuration was different. The distance between land masses was reduced. A maritime crossing that seems extraordinary today could have been substantially more manageable under ancient conditions. That does not prove the story describes the last ice age. Oral traditions can change meaning across generations, and mythic narratives often combine geography with spiritual concepts. But it demonstrates that the physical setting of the story is not imaginary. The coastline really did exist in configurations that are now gone. One of the strongest archaeological discoveries in the region makes this even more significant. In 1959, human remains were excavated at Arlington Springs on Santa Rosa Island. Later, radiocarbon work placed the remains at approximately 13,000 years old. The discovery demonstrated that people were living on the Channel Islands during a period when Santa Rosa still existed as a much larger landmass. Someone had reached and inhabited that island landscape at a time when sea level was dramatically lower than today. Whatever their exact route, these people were part of a coastal world that has since been transformed. The significance extends beyond one archaeological site. For much of the 20th century, discussions about the first Americans emphasized migration through an interior corridor between retreating ice sheets. Increasing archaeological evidence has complicated that model. The Kelp Highway hypothesis, associated particularly with archaeologists such as John Erlandson and colleagues, proposes that some early populations may have moved along the Pacific coast, exploiting rich marine environments as they traveled. Kelp forests provide fish, shellfish, marine mammals and other resources, creating a productive ecological corridor along much of the Pacific Rim. If coastal migration played a major role in the peopling of the Americas, then the ancient California coastline becomes more important than it first appears. The coastline of 13,000 years ago is not the coastline of today. Much of the shelf that once stood above sea level is now underwater. Any camps, temporary settlements, fishing stations, or village sites located there may have been drowned and buried. Archaeologists studying the modern shoreline are therefore looking at only a fraction of the landscape occupied by earlier generations. This creates a major preservation problem. On land, archaeology can identify buried sites by excavation, soil changes, artifacts, foundations, hearths, and other traces. Underwater, the same evidence may be hidden beneath sediment, disturbed by currents, covered by kelp, or located at depths that make conventional excavation difficult. A site can exist for thousands of years and remain invisible because nobody has the technology to search the right place. The absence of archaeological evidence is not automatically evidence that the site never existed. The rancher's notebook story, however, appears to describe something more recent than the Ice Age. That distinction matters. The elder's account reportedly referred to a village, fishing areas, freshwater, burial grounds, and a gradual loss of land in terms that sounded closer to remembered community history than deep prehistory. It may therefore represent a much later coastal settlement whose location was altered by shoreline erosion and sea level changes. Alternatively, the story may have combined several layers of memory, connecting recent local knowledge with much older traditions about the transformation of the channel. There is no reason to assume that every Chumash story about lost land refers to the same event. In fact, the opposite may be more reasonable. Different generations experience different environmental changes. A tradition could preserve memories of a village abandoned hundreds of years ago while also containing older cosmological elements inherited from a much earlier period. Stories evolve, details merge, names change, spiritual meanings are added. Yet geographical information can survive inside those stories even when the original event is no longer understood in historical terms. The key question is whether oral traditions can preserve accurate geographical memories over very long periods. For much of modern academic history, many researchers were skeptical. Oral tradition was considered culturally valuable but historically unstable. A story transmitted without writing was assumed to change too much to preserve precise information about landscapes thousands of years old. But research in other parts of the world has challenged that assumption. Studies of indigenous Australian traditions, for example, have identified stories that appear to preserve memories of ancient coastal configurations that disappeared after post-glacial sea level rise. That does not mean every oral tradition should be treated as a geological map. It means the old division between myth and historical evidence can be too simplistic. A story can contain spiritual meaning and geographical memory at the same time. A rainbow bridge can be a cosmological symbol while also preserving a memory of an ancient crossing. A story about land disappearing beneath water can express spiritual ideas while also remembering a real environmental transformation. The only responsible approach is to identify the physical claims and test those claims independently. Early American anthropology rarely worked that way. In California, the professionalization of anthropology around the beginning of the 20th century encouraged researchers to classify indigenous traditions according to linguistic, social, and religious categories. This work was enormously valuable. Researchers such as Alfred Kroeber and John Harrington documented languages, kinship systems, ceremonies, stories, and material culture that might otherwise have been lost. But the institutional structure of the discipline often separated cultural narratives from geological research. A story about a rainbow bridge was treated as cosmology. A submerged shoreline was treated as geology. The possibility that the two might contain related information was rarely the central question. Timing made the problem worse. The elders who possessed the deepest memories of the pre-mission world were dying during precisely the period when American anthropology was becoming organized enough to record them systematically. Fernando Librado died in 1915, while Harrington's work with him was still part of a much larger unfinished body of research. Harrington himself accumulated enormous quantities of field notes, much of which remained unpublished or difficult for researchers to access. For decades, information that could potentially have interested archaeologists, geologists, and historians existed in separate archives that were rarely consulted together. The ranchers' notebooks occupied an even more fragile position. They were never part of a major scientific collection. They remained within a family. At some point, portions were reportedly shown to a regional historical society, and a small amount of material was transcribed into a local publication. By then, the original context had already become difficult to reconstruct. Who exactly wrote each passage? What words did the elder actually use? Which details came from the rancher, and which were added later by family members? Without the original notebook, those questions cannot be answered with confidence. Yet the physical claim contained within the story can still be investigated. The elder reportedly described people living near fresh water and productive fishing grounds, with canoes regularly launching toward the channel. She described land gradually giving way rather than disappearing in a single violent event. She also reportedly mentioned shapes visible beneath the water during certain calm conditions. That last detail is the weakest part of the account because it has no independent verification and could easily reflect ordinary underwater rocks, kelp formations, optical effects, or later embellishment. The broader idea of a drowned coastline is much stronger. Geological surveys have reconstructed ancient shorelines throughout the Santa Barbara Channel. Researchers can identify submerged river channels, terraces, and other features created when areas now underwater were exposed to the atmosphere. These features are not speculative. They are physical remnants of landscapes that existed before sea level rose. Their depth can be compared with established sea level models, allowing researchers to reconstruct where ancient shorelines probably stood. Modern technology has changed the investigation dramatically. Multi-beam sonar can map the seafloor with extraordinary detail, revealing contours invisible from the surface. Sub-bottom acoustic systems can penetrate sediments and identify buried geological structures. Together, these tools allow researchers to reconstruct drowned landscapes without immediately disturbing them. In a region where the ancient coastline may extend many miles beyond the modern shore, this is essential. Archaeologists first need to know where ancient rivers, terraces, beaches, and sheltered areas existed before they can search for cultural remains. Research around the Channel Islands has already identified drowned landforms that correspond with predicted ancient coastlines. Ancient river channels extend beneath the modern sea. Stepped terraces mark former shoreline positions. These discoveries provide the environmental framework needed for future archaeological searches. They do not prove that every unusual story about a submerged village is true. They establish something more fundamental: the physical landscape required for such stories to contain real geographical memory actually existed. The difference between those two statements is crucial. It is now reasonable to say that people lived in coastal landscapes that were later drowned. It is reasonable to say that archaeological sites may exist underwater. It is reasonable to investigate indigenous oral traditions for geographical information. It is not reasonable to claim that a specific village has been found when no excavation has confirmed it. The mystery becomes stronger, not weaker, when those boundaries are maintained, because the unanswered question remains genuinely unanswered. The Santa Barbara Channel is also not a uniform underwater plain. Its geological history is complicated by tectonic activity, erosion, changing currents, sediment movement, and variations in sea level rise. Some areas that were once exposed may now be deeply buried. Others may have been disturbed by wave action before being submerged. A village could leave substantial remains in one location and almost nothing recognizable in another. Organic materials can disappear, wooden structures can decay, burial sites can be disturbed, stone tools can be transported. Even a confirmed archaeological site might be difficult to identify as a village without extensive investigation. This is why the idea of finding the lost village should not be reduced to discovering a single wall beneath the sea. The archaeological signature might be subtle. It could involve concentrations of shell, stone, charcoal, modified bone, ancient hearths, or patterns in sediment. A place that was once an important settlement may not resemble a ruined city at all. The most valuable discovery could be a small cluster of artifacts sitting on an ancient shoreline that no longer exists. The story of Homkak adds another dimension. Point Conception remains culturally important to Chumash communities today. The headland is not simply an archaeological site from a vanished civilization. It is part of a living indigenous cultural landscape. That distinction matters because the history being investigated is not completely dead. The people whose ancestors lived along these shores are still here. Their traditions are not merely evidence for outsiders to extract. They are part of an ongoing relationship with the land and ocean. Modern organizations such as the Wishtoyo Chumash Foundation have worked to protect Chumash cultural and environmental heritage along the coast. The Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians continues to maintain a cultural connection to Homkak and the surrounding region. Any future archaeological investigation has to exist within that reality. Searching for ancient sites should not mean treating the ocean as a treasure chest of mysterious objects. It means understanding that the submerged landscape is part of a much larger cultural history that indigenous communities have carried into the present. There is another reason the story deserves caution. The phrase "lost civilization" can easily distort what the evidence actually shows. The Chumash did not need to belong to some unknown advanced civilization for their ancestors to have crossed water, maintained complex trade, remembered changing coastlines, or occupied islands thousands of years ago. Their documented maritime technology was already sophisticated. Their communities were organized, economically connected, and deeply adapted to the Pacific environment. The archaeological evidence does not require an invented civilization to explain their achievements. What makes the submerged coastline remarkable is precisely the opposite. It demonstrates how much complexity can disappear without requiring a civilization to vanish completely. A village can be erased from the visible landscape simply because the sea rises. A shoreline can move, a route can disappear, a burial ground can become seabed, a generation can carry the memory, and then the memory can survive only as a story. Centuries later, researchers can look at a sonar map and realize that the impossible landscape described by the story was physically real. The Limu tradition may therefore be understood as more than an origin myth and less than a literal geological report. It belongs to a cultural system that explains relationships between people, islands, dolphins, water, and the sacred world. At the same time, its geographical setting corresponds to a landscape that geological evidence confirms once existed. The two forms of knowledge do not need to be identical to be mutually illuminating. A story does not become scientifically false simply because it uses symbolic language. The same principle applies to the rancher's elder. Her account should not be elevated into certainty simply because modern science has discovered drowned shorelines, but neither should it be discarded simply because the original notebook is incomplete. The responsible position sits between those extremes. The notebook is weak evidence for a specific village. The geological record is strong evidence for a changing coastline. Chumash traditions provide evidence that islands, crossings, and changing relationships between land and water were culturally remembered. Modern archaeology provides a method for determining whether physical traces survive beneath the sea. That last step is the one that remains unfinished. A significant portion of the ancient continental shelf around the Channel Islands has not been examined at the resolution necessary to locate and identify archaeological sites. Surveying underwater is expensive. Excavation is even more difficult. Researchers must first reconstruct where ancient shorelines were located, then determine which areas would have been attractive to human settlement, then search those areas for evidence that survived thousands of years of geological change. The search also requires patience because the most promising locations may not be obvious from the modern coastline. A freshwater source that attracted a village thousands of years ago may now be buried. A sheltered bay may now lie beneath open water. A river mouth may have migrated. A beach terrace may have been submerged and covered by sediment. The location that looks ordinary on a modern nautical chart may have been a perfect settlement site in another geological era. Imagine standing at Point Conception today. The cliffs appear permanent. The Pacific stretches toward the horizon. Waves break against rocks that seem to define the edge of the continent itself. Yet that apparent permanence is an illusion created by human time. Coastlines move. Islands change. Rivers migrate. Sea levels rise and fall. The ground beneath the ocean can preserve landscapes that no living person has ever seen. Somewhere beneath the channel may be nothing more than natural rock and sediment. That remains the most conservative assumption until evidence says otherwise. But there may also be traces of people who occupied this region before the coastline assumed its modern form. There could be an ancient shoreline, a former river, a shell concentration, a hearth, a tool, or the remains of a settlement. Finding even a small piece of cultural material in the correct geological context would transform a question into evidence. The most intriguing possibility is not necessarily a spectacular underwater city. It is something quieter. A cluster of ordinary objects lying exactly where an ancient shoreline model predicts people once lived. Shell beads, stone tools, burned material, modified bone, fragments of a canoe or wooden structure preserved under sediment. Such discoveries would not prove every detail of the rancher's story. They would do something more important. They would demonstrate that memories preserved in Chumash traditions can contain geographical information about landscapes that disappeared from the surface thousands of years ago. That possibility forces a reconsideration of what an archive actually is. Written documents are not the only records of the past. Stone preserves information. Sediment preserves information. ocean floors preserve information. Human languages preserve information. Oral traditions preserve information, although each form has different limitations. A government archive can lose a document through neglect. A family can lose a notebook. A language can lose a speaker. But a shoreline can remain preserved beneath sediment long after everyone who knew it existed is gone. For generations, the Chumash stories were often placed in a category called mythology, a category that encouraged outsiders to ask what the stories meant culturally, but not necessarily what physical memories they might contain. Modern archaeology has begun asking a different question, not whether a traditional story is literally true in every detail, but whether particular geographical claims inside the story can be tested. That is a much more productive approach because it respects the cultural meaning of the tradition, while also allowing independent scientific investigation. The story of the drowned coastline therefore has no need for a hidden civilization, secret government project, or impossible technology. Its mystery is already profound enough. People lived on landscapes that no longer exist. They crossed waters whose distances changed. They watched shorelines move. They remembered places that later generations could no longer see. Some of those memories survived in stories. The physical evidence survived somewhere else, beneath the ocean, waiting for technology capable of locating it. And perhaps that is the most important detail in the entire story. The knowledge was not necessarily missing. It was separated. The people who remembered the landscape belonged to one tradition. The geological evidence belonged to another field. The archaeological questions belonged to a third. For much of the 20th century, those pieces remained in different intellectual rooms. An elder could describe a lost coastline without having access to a geological map. A geologist could reconstruct a drowned shoreline without knowing that a traditional story described something remarkably similar. An archaeologist could excavate a coastal site without realizing that its location had already been preserved in oral memory. Only when those forms of evidence are placed beside one another does the shape become visible. The shape is not proof of a single legendary event. It is evidence of a much larger process. The coastline itself is an archive, and much of that archive is underwater. At Humkuk, the old Chumash name for Point Conception, that idea carries particular weight. The place was already understood as a threshold long before modern science knew how dramatically the surrounding geography had changed. The ocean beyond the cliffs appears to be a boundary, but beneath it are layers of former landscapes. The channel is not simply water between the mainland and islands. It is also the location of an older world that was gradually submerged as the planet emerged from the last ice age. The rancher's notebooks may never be recovered in their original form. The exact words of the elder may never be known. The specific village may never be located. Even if researchers eventually identify an archaeological site beneath the channel, there may be no way to prove that it is the place described in those late 19th century notes. Those uncertainties should remain part of the story rather than being hidden. What can be established is already remarkable. The Chumash lived in complex coastal communities for thousands of years. They developed sophisticated maritime technology. They traveled between mainland and islands. Their traditions preserved stories about crossings and changing relationships between land and sea. The Northern Channel Islands were once part of a much larger landmass. Sea level rose dramatically after the last glacial period. Human remains demonstrate occupation of the islands more than 10,000 years ago. Modern sonar has identified ancient drowned landscapes beneath the channel. The remaining question is physical. What, if anything, is still preserved on those submerged landscapes? If the answer is nothing, the geological story remains important. If the answer is an ancient settlement, then the archaeological history of the Santa Barbara Channel becomes richer in ways that can be measured directly. And if an archaeological site happens to correspond closely with the geographical details preserved in Chumash tradition, the significance would extend beyond the discovery itself. It would demonstrate that oral memory can sometimes preserve a remarkably durable record of environmental change. The water around Point Conception has been moving for thousands of years. Currents meet there. Waves reshape the shore. Sediment travels across the seafloor. The modern cliffs appear solid, but they represent only one temporary arrangement of land and sea. Beneath the surface is another coastline, and beneath that coastline are older geological layers still. Somewhere in that submerged sequence may be traces of people who stood on ground that no longer exists above the waves. The story, then, is not really about proving that a legendary village is waiting beneath the ocean. It is about understanding how easily human history can disappear when the landscape itself changes. A community can remember a place after the place is gone. A story can survive after the shoreline disappears. And centuries later, science can reconstruct the physical environment that gives that story a new context. At Humkak, the Western Gate remains where it has always been, facing an ocean that has carried away more than anyone standing on the cliffs today can see. The Chumash did not need modern maps to know that the sea held another world. Their traditions carried memories of islands, crossings, dolphins, and changing landscapes long before sonar could reveal drowned shorelines. Modern research has not proven every story. It has done something more valuable. It has shown that the ancient landscape behind those stories was real, and that beneath the present-day channel there are still portions of that landscape waiting to be understood.